Good evening, and welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. We are working our way through the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. 13 years of seminary transcripts from that Trungpa Rinpoche would take his students off for about 3 months every year for a program that was called the Vajradhatu Seminary. And there would be periods of sitting when they did nothing but sit, kind of like Datun. And there would be periods of study mixed with sitting. And Trungpa Rinpoche liked to mix it up. It wasn't regular, like you might have 5 days of just nothing but sitting, and then you'd have 8 days of study, and then you might have 9 days of nothing but sitting and 3 days of study. He didn't want people to sort of become clock watchers and anticipate the changes. And the same thing in the sitting periods. We would do alternate periods of sitting and walking meditation, and sometimes you would sit for an hour and a half or 2 hours and walk for 5 minutes. And other times you'd walk for 30 minutes and sit for 10. And he wanted to, I'm being extreme, but there were times like that. And he did this for 13 years, starting in 1973, and I think the last seminary was in 1987, so there was a year or two that was missed in there. And then these seminaries were divided into 2 parts. The first part was called Sutrayana, and it was the teachings of the Hinayana and the Mahayana stages of the path. These are what he called the foundational stage, and then the second stage, the middle stage of the path, which was all of the middle stage being about emptiness and the bodhisattva and everything that constellates around those 2 core ideas, and there was a lot. And then there would be a division, and the last part of seminary, that maybe the last month or so, would be about the tantric teachings, the Vajrayana, the adamantine vehicle. Yana means vehicle, and Vajra means indestructible. It's actually the name for a weapon that the Hindu god Indra, the god of war, wielded. It's kind of like Thor's hammer, in that it was indestructible, and he would throw it to destroy his enemies, and then it would return to his hand. And it became the symbol of the last vehicle, the Vajrayana, the indestructible or adamantine vehicle. We're on the first volume, the Hinayana, the so-called lesser vehicle. That's what Hinayana literally means, which Trungpa Rinpoche felt was really foundational, because it's extraordinarily profound, and all of the understandings and principles that one develops at this stage of the path are foundational and part of each succeeding stage, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. You never let go of them. So, for instance, the 2 main practices of the Hinayana are shamatha practice. Shamatha means, these are meditation practices. Shamatha means abiding in peace. And vipassana, which is usually translated as superior seeing, he translated it as panoramic awareness. So shamatha has the virtue, you're focusing your mind one pointedly on an object. It has the virtue that, a number of virtues. One is that perhaps for the first time you might become aware of the extent to which you're thinking all the time. Most of us, even after we've been practicing for many years, are unaware of how much time we spend lost in thought. But the more we practice, especially the more we begin to bring the practice into our daily lives, the more we will become aware of that, which is really part of the subject of tonight's talk. The other virtues of shamatha are that you begin to develop the ability to stay present, to focus your mind and not devolve continually into thought and go lost in dream. And that's really the main virtue of shamatha, and it's foundational. It's a skill, you might say, or a property of awareness that you take through to the very end of the path. Only it becomes natural and not a skill. It becomes part of who you are. And then the third value of shamatha has a teacher that I like a lot. I mean, I've never met him, but I've heard him speak in recordings and read his book, Our Pristine Mind. He says, it's really like having a really good nap, shamatha, because you get a rest. You get a rest to some extent, from the anxiety of thought. Thought is driven by anxiety, hope and fear, judgment, wanting change, wanting improvement, worry about yourself. And you get a rest from that. Vipassana, which is the other main practice that starts with the Hinayana, and again, it's never left behind, hardly. It's the awareness that when one is not lost in thought, you can be aware of your life in the present moment in a very broad, open way that's very accurate and becomes the better you become at this open awareness, the more sensitive you become to the phenomenal world and more intelligent and perceptive. We could do an exercise, maybe we will, that demonstrates this together at some point, maybe a little later in this talk. So these practices go all the way to enlightenment. You know, the ability to stay present, that's shamatha, and this wide open panoramic awareness of the world, clear, which is vipassana. And it becomes the mind of the Buddha. So it's not as though we jettison these early stages at all. So we're in the Hinayana, and another aspect of the way Trungpa Rinpoche taught was he always taught the beginning stages of the path from the viewpoint of the end, from the viewpoint of the most advanced teachings. So that it brought a tremendous profundity to even the simplest and most basic, so-called basic, of these teachings. The section we're on in the first volume, the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. By the way, that's almost a joke, that title, because it's a play on his name. You see, his name was Chögyam Trungpa, and Chögyam is an abbreviation of Chöki Gyatso, which literally means Ocean of Dharma. So we're reading the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. That's cute, huh? That's Judy Leaf. Perhaps her sense of humor. And we're on chapter 53. We're just using this as kind of a structure to go through these ideas and think about them and talk about them among ourselves. This one's called The Power of Flickering Thoughts. It's about suffering. And there are a couple of main points. You know, the first of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. When the Buddha achieved enlightenment, he didn't think he could communicate what he had discovered. And then he ran into several of his fellow renunciates, people who had been practicing austerities with him. And at first they thought that he had fallen off the path, because he had given up his asceticism and actually had taken milk and honey at one point instead of starving himself to death like they were. And then they realized that something had changed, and they asked him for teachings, and he gave the first of his enlightened teachings at the Deer Park, a park that you can go to now. It's in Varanasi, it's in Sarnath, which is a little area outside of Varanasi, a city in India, which is reputed to be, likes to claim to be, the oldest living city in the world, 4,000 years. And you can go to the Deer Park now and make circumambulations around the stupa. And the first thing he taught were the Four Noble Truths, and the first of these is the truth of suffering. Because what meditation is fundamentally about It's not about getting blissed out. It's about truly, accurately seeing suffering. And the funny thing is that when you see suffering with the mind of clarity, the pain could still be there. You know, if somebody stabbed you in the leg or you lost a loved one or whatever. But the depth of it is not, because you are not torturing yourself. When you have the mind of meditation, you have given up discursive thought, wishing things were otherwise, and you're just seeing it. So somebody asked, I remember somebody asked Trungpa Rinpoche once, if the Buddha, when he had a cold, did he suffer? And Rinpoche said, the Buddha suffered much more than you. Because you are thinking so much that you hardly even notice your cold. You know, but the Buddha was right there with it, you know, seeing it. But what he didn't have was the suffering of thought, the suffering of wishing things were otherwise, which is really what thought is always about. The thought of regret, of the past, of wishing that the past were here again, or wishing it had never happened, the hope for the future, that the future is going to be better. That constant anxiety that drives thought. And that's what is lost every time we come back into the present moment. It's the virtue of practice, whether it be shamatha or vipassana, it doesn't matter. As soon as one comes back to the present, you're cutting through that fundamental suffering of thought, but you're also seeing it. It's like when you realize that you're thinking, the instruction is just see it. And if you see that thought and you think, darn it, I was thinking, I'm a bad meditator, that's more of the same. You know, then you bring awareness to that. And at some point you have to stop the judgment and just see it. And at that point, that's really profound. At that point, you enter the realm of egolessness. Because ego is always the one who wants to see things and see them getting better. And as soon as you can just see it, ego is gone. It's just not there. It's not happening. It's just pure, clear awareness. So even if you just see ego, you know, like the desire that you feel like you're a lousy meditator and you wish you were better, and then see that. And at some point, we call it developing compassion for oneself. Because at some point you give up that constant self-criticism. Self-criticism is a total waste of time. Guilt, self-criticism, it's the machinations of ego, of confusion. And it goes on and on and on, as long as one chooses for it to. So he says, the original problem began because you lost your awareness, and so became split between I and other. Now this isn't something that happened a long time ago and is continuing today. It happens every instant. Here we are in this sea of phenomena, constantly arising in the present moment. You know, now there's Lane, you know, and now there's the floor, and now there's this voice. All these phenomena are arising, and suddenly we say, that's Lane, and here am I. And there's the split that he's talking about. But you don't need to make that statement. You can be utterly intelligent about who's around and what's going on. But as soon as we say that, there's Lane and here am I, then there's a problem. What's our relationship? Are we friends? Are we enemies? You know, what are we going to do together? We're going to eat, you know, break bread. Should I feel good? Should I feel bad in Lane's presence? You know, and on and on. So this is what he's talking about. The first glimpse of suffering is a sense of clumsiness. You are unable to coordinate the body, speech, and mind. It's because we're wondering, what do I do? What do I do about that there? And it's clumsy, it's awkward. He calls it the ape instinct. And from clumsiness comes irritation, because you feel that the world is attacking you. You may not feel like it's an all-out attack, but there's this problem How do I relate? I relate. And so the practice is always to cut through that by becoming aware. Aware of what? Aware of what's going on in your mind, aware of what's going on in the world. It's always the practice of awareness. There's nothing else. And from that comes everything else. Compassion, wisdom. And the compassion starts when you begin to give up the idea of punishing yourself, trying to make yourself into something better, which is a form of self-punishment, such a drag. He says, when true awareness takes place, suffering does not exist. It is not necessarily that you do not suffer, like loss and losing your hair and getting old and all that stuff. But the haunting quality that fundamentally you are in trouble is removed. For those of us who are getting old, don't we think we're in trouble? We're losing our bodily functions. Am I still going to be able to walk? Am I going to wind up with all my faculties? Am I going to wind up in a nursing home drooling? And it's that fundamental fear of loss, of insufficiency. And the moment that we come back into awareness, it doesn't matter. You can be with absolutely anything. And in fact, that's the yogic path, to be with absolutely anything that arises. That's what the great yogis did. That's what Milarepa did in his cave. It's embracing it all. Every last inch of what one can experience. There's that famous story of Milarepa in the cave, and the demoness, Tsering comes to attack him. And she appears before him and she bites his toe and she won't let go. And he preaches the Dharma to her. He says, I'm a holy man, I'm on the path of enlightenment and you're obstructing my path. You're accumulating bad karma. You should, stop doing this and become contrite and good. And she says, you're just trying to get rid of me. And she doesn't let go until finally, he accepts her, truly accepts her as part of the world, as part of his world, without trying to get rid of her, change her. And at that point, she transforms, and she becomes the goddess, Tsering, and she becomes his helper. And that's the beautiful story. So who are our Tsering-mas? Who are our demons? And then he says, suffering begins with a very simple and ordinary flicker of thought. That's there, I'm here. Which derives from basic bewilderment. Basic bewilderment is the split. It suddenly appears that there's, in the middle of all this space and flashing lights and colors and all that, there's a thing. And that thing implies the existence of a perceiver here. And that, suddenly there's this split and a journey from that to this. And then from this back to that. What's going on with that? You've got to keep it alive, the dance, from that to this, from this to that. Or else, I am going to die. I don't have anything to relate to. There's no proof that I'm here. He says, there is a state of uncertainty, generally dull and stupefied state of mind, which occurs every fraction of a second in our state of being all the time. We are blinded by it. It's that I-other split. And then I like this, and this we can actually discuss, I'm not quite sure a lot could be said. He says, pain is not coming from pain or pleasure, but from wanting to bury your head in yourself and smell your own wickedness. Isn't that a great line? Smell your own wickedness. And he said it's like living in a cocoon. And we know what that is. The cocoon is like your smelly armpit. It's the world of your reflections. You see your reflections everywhere in the people around you. Does that person like me? Does that person hate me? And you're seeing your bounce back, your reflection. And you live inside this world, and it's like living inside a cocoon. And he likened it, he said, it's claustrophobic. And it doesn't smell good after a while. But it's familiar. It has the virtue of being very familiar. Anybody have anything to say at this point? I'm just going to open it up a little bit. Okay, I'll go on for a while. Raise your hand if you want to jump in. He says, within that stupidity, this kind of like, this focus on the other, based on wanting to build your, he says, you begin to find something, passion, lust, hatred, aggression, all these things towards the other, based on wanting to build yourself up, which is not necessary. You could just live simply, directly in the present, without trying to build yourself up, which is future-oriented, and the future never comes. This is pretty fierce. He says, the practice of meditation is not designed to develop pleasure, but to understand the truth of suffering. I'm going to repeat this. I repeated this from the first page. He says, through awareness, suffering is somewhat changed in its perspective. It is not necessarily that you do not suffer, but the haunting quality of suffering, that fundamentally you are in trouble, is removed. I mean, does that resonate? That when you practice, that haunting quality, that fundamentally you're in trouble, that comes to make us depressed, in the mornings, that I'm dying, I'm losing, what I cherish, I'm in a bad place, all those things. As soon as you come present, it evaporates. Then he talks about kunjung. Jung means to arise. Kun is the word for everything. Everything arising. And what he's talking about is just what we've been talking about, that when you concretize the world, things arise. Those things, and they around you. I keep thinking of, remember back in the 60s, people who were interested in sensory deprivation tanks? Remember that? And the idea was that if you remove all sense perception, people don't know that they're even here. You need to have something out there to prove that I'm here. It was really hard to get rid of all sensory sense deprivation, to have it be total. And then he talks about semjung, which is the mental events, the 51. He says the kunjung, that's the arising of everything, arising of all these thoughts and mental events, progresses from small to large. Things escalate, swell, and expand until they become very large in some cases. I mean, we take these little things, like a person looks at us the wrong way, and suddenly it just escalates almost so rapidly you can hardly even see it happening, into a full-blown fear and animosity. It happens all the time. In the subway, between our friends and us. But when we begin to see it, then we have the opportunity to short-circuit it. That's why we're studying this in this chapter. He says, this is the close, being able to relate with the subtleties of mental events, of mental shifts, that's like these judgments, is connected with the Hinayana principle of paying attention to every activity that we do in small doses. There is no such thing as sudden psychodrama without any cause and effect, without some small precedent. Every psychodrama that takes place in our mind or interactions has its origin in little flickering thoughts and little flickers of attention. That's there, I'm here, what's our relationship? Uh-oh, I don't like the way that's looking at me. And then the reactions build and ricochet back and forth. And pretty soon you've got World War III. So we can have a discussion, if you like. Do we have the microphone? Yeah, good. Complaints? Objections? Say your name, too. For the
I'm
record.
Cliff.
Yeah.
Just wonderful. Just wonderful. The teachings, and I'll just give you my thought, that you're expounding, to me, it rings into my heart. It comes from the highest understanding down, starting with the Four Noble Truths. I don't want to pontificate here, but I just want to comment on the things that you said. With the understanding of dukkha, of the First Noble Truth, it gets taught so many times, it's attachment, it's aversion. You get stuck wanting that car and that money and that perfect partner, and you're attached to the thoughts of. Well, yes, but that's the lowest understanding of it. The highest understanding is we become attached to this insane construction of an ego self, this persona that does not exist except in our own minds. It doesn't exist. And we create a whole life around this imaginary thing. And that's the sticking and the attachment to that. And what you're saying is talking directly to that ignorance, that flickering on that creates all of that momentum of suffering and dissatisfaction, and that you were saying that feeling inside that things are not right. They're not right because you can't reconcile this imaginary thing with something that doesn't exist. And it just gets to the heart of the matter, and you don't hear these teachings often. They're very precious and very rare today. I think that's lovely. The other thing that I was wondering about with vipassana, because it's also translated as insight. And this is a question, in the last two of the Eightfold Path, you have shamatha, samadhi, and sati. And sati is translated as mindfulness, but I don't think that's correct. Is it possible that what's referred to there as sati is, and I love that, the translation of broad panorama, which is that awareness that's open rather than the focused attention of shamatha. So what I was thinking is that perhaps in the Eightfold Path that it's referring to having the broad perspective and the practice of the focused perspective, and that the two of them work together to create a ripening space for vipassana. Again, it's just more of a technical thing because the theory and the principle is exactly the same. So just your thoughts on that.
It sounds accurate. These two basic principles of meditation practice that are embodied in shamatha and vipassana or vipassana, the Pali. I forget what the Pali is for shamatha. can't remember, but it doesn't matter. You know, they're the same practice. And the two basic principles are simply being able to stay undistracted by thought, that's shamatha, and aware, and we practice it by focusing one pointedly on an object. And the other principle is to be aware of your whole environment. I mean, really, when you do walking meditation, you have to be practicing vipassana or vipassana, because you have to be aware of the environment so that you can follow, you know, and not walk into the wall, you know, and know where you are. So you've got a wide open awareness. And these two principles are core. Yeah. And they go right through to the end of the path. I mean, you can read, there's a wonderful book by Tulku Ujin. He was a great teacher. He was the father of Tsoknyi Rinpoche, who's out and about today, and Mingyur Rinpoche, who's out and about, and also Chögyam Nyima. And there was a fourth son, who I don't think teaches. I'm not sure. And Tulku Ujin is passed. But a lot of my Dharma brothers and sisters went and studied with him when Trungpa Rinpoche died. And he was a great Dzogchen master. And if you want to read a dense book, I only take it into retreat. I don't try to read it too much at home. It's too potent for me at home. And it's called Rainbow Painting. Beautiful book. And it's just, you know, some of his students transcribed his talks and edited them into the book. And in it, he talks about the practice is the same practice. This practice, if you call it vipassana, if you call it emptiness, shunyata, if you call it mahamudra, and if you call it dzogchen, or trekchit, cutting through, you know, it's the same practice. What changes is the way in which you see the world, because as the practice becomes more and more a part of you, more and more natural, your understanding of what we're sitting in the middle of here, including us, changes. And the first change is the discovery of egolessness. How profound is that? That I, this thing that I've been carrying around my entire 74 years, there it is, you know, and it has all this history of successes and failures and hurts and pleasures, you know, going back, and I think of myself in this particular way, we all do, that it's a myth, and that you could let it go and live without it. Wow, that is earth-shaking. That is so radical. And that's the first stage of the path. That's the Hinayana, you know. That's the sort of the culmination of the Hinayana stage of the path. Never mind what happens at the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. So what he says is that really all the practice is always the same. Coming present by using shamatha, you know, that's the principle of not being distracted by thought, of being able to be here, now, and vipassana, which is to be aware of everything, everything that is arising. And it doesn't mean you're aware of it all at the same time. You're not superhuman. But you have this open, wide field of awareness. And what changes and makes it turn into shunyata, into mahamudra, and into dzogchen is the way in which you understand who and what the world and everyone is within that open space of awareness, and as a transformation that is going on in one's understanding. It's really extraordinarily beautiful. So the practice that we're doing here tonight is the best. You just do it more and more. And the thing to do is that when you do it at home, you know, it's really important to have a sitting practice. I resisted it to have a regular sitting practice for years. Trungpa Rinpoche always said, just do it. It works. And he's right. You don't even have to think about it. All you have to do is sit down and try and do it. And in fact, the less you think about it, you know, the better. Like, don't think about, gee, how am I doing? Am I getting it now? Am I not getting it? Am I a good meditator, a bad meditator? All of that is garbage. That'll just screw you up, make you unhappy or make you falsely elated. You just do it, and it's like water dripping away on a stone, wearing it away. The transformation happens because you are shifting allegiance from that neurotic back and forth of I and other and everything that is entailed in that to this, to the real world, which is constantly arising and passing away in the present moment. He called it that. Shifting your loyalty, shifting your allegiance. You can't force it, but it happens. So we just do it. It's like hygiene. And studying helps. Speaking for myself. Some people, it doesn't. There was that example of the Buddha had a disciple who was very stupid, and he couldn't hear the teachings, So the Buddha just gave him a broom and said, sweep, and every time you do it, say, sweeping, sweeping, sweeping. And supposedly the guy got enlightened. Rochelle would like the mic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the talk. John, it was great. And I really like your comment.
Me too.
A friend of ours wrote a book called The Backwards Ati. The Backwards Ati. Ken Friedman. Mm-hmm. It meant for more advanced practitioners in the Shambhala community. But that's what you're talking about. Because everything that Trungpa Rinpoche taught was the fruition backwards. That's why he was such a genius in saying that, explaining things from a fruitional point of view, and then depending on where we are on the path, that's how we understand it.